Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
My dad is from Mexico, and my mother is here. 2 weeks every summer, we go and live in Mexico, alternating from my grandpa's main house to my aunt's house that's on hundreds of acres of land off in the boonies, so to speak. Be at my aunt's. They have a huge crater lake that animals drink and such, and rarely they'd let us swim. Go swimming with cousins. We're playing and having a good time, and all of a sudden animals go crazy. They all leave, and we, being stupid kids, shrug it off, swimming in the deeper part of the lake. I can't see anyone but this girl. I think it's one of their friends that would come and play from time to time. Be playing with the girl. She says I should get out now before I get pruny. Start swimming towards shore. She grabs my shirt, says she wants to play again. Say no, let's go eat and we'll come back. She says no. I get pissed off, like unusually pissed off, and shove her. She lets go and says she'll see me later. Go and get my food and sit on the lake's edge. Talk with her, offer food, but she doesn't take any. My cousins call for me and saying we're going to town. Yell back, can she come with me? They look at each other, run and pull me away from the water. Pissed off, what the hell? They say that's their sister. She died in the 90s before the youngest sister was born, because there were a string of really bad crops, and they struggled to feed 4. They say she almost drowned the youngest. It explains my sudden anger. That night I heard sad singing from the lake. It was my aunt singing the girl a lullaby so she would leave me alone. Apparently it soothes her until someone else around her age shows up and she tries the same thing.
Not OP, but I have a creepy story. Mom is from Ireland and moved to America. We would spend our summers in Ireland growing up. I would go with my uncle and cousins fishing and exploring. Came across a group of trees clustered together. My uncle said, "That's a fairy fort. Stay away from that." I said, "There is no such thing as fairies." Suddenly I felt this sharp pain in my eyes, like someone had put needles in them. My uncle started speaking in Irish, and suddenly the pain went away. My uncle said, "Now apologize to them as you hurt their feelings." I felt stupid, but I said, "I am sorry. I didn't know you existed. Please forgive me." I had this feeling like a hand was caressing my face. I yelled and begged my uncle to go back to the car. We decided not to tell my mom or anyone else that was there. Cousins told their Muslim, who in turn told mine, and my mom yelled at me for being stupid. My mom said to me, "There are more things out there than you can believe. Just because you don't see them doesn't mean they don't exist. You are lucky they didn't do anything permanent to you." Later, I found out my uncle bought a cow from a farmer and brought it to the fairy fort and left it there. That was what he said to them in Irish. He would give them a cow if they would stop hurting me. Have no desire to ever leave the United States again in case I do something stupid like that again.
Go to Mexico for Grandma's funeral. Never liked Grandma as much as Grandpa in life because being a kid, he'd give us money and candy as she would scold him for it. Whatever, well, there for Grandma's funeral with the whole family. My sister had recently had her sweet 15, and that was my grandma's last visit to the US before she got sick and died. The week of death, it is customary to hold a wake or rosary prayer circle every night in the garage or room of the deceased's home. The first night as we were preparing the dinner, my aunt was over my grandma's casket talking to her. She said my grandma was pissed because they poofed her hair and made her wear makeup. She said, "Go find a brush." My cousins thought it'd be funny and grabbed mine while we fought over it. My aunt took it and soothed down Grandma's hair. When she handed it back to me, something like electricity snapped our palms and we dropped it under the casket. My aunt picked it up, prayed over it, and handed it back. She said to keep it close or a witch will use it against me. That thing is locked in our family safe in Mexico. I'd cry every time I used it, so for sanity's sake I left it there. At Grandma's funeral, it is customary as the dirt is filling the resting spot you toss in something personal. A favorite rosary perhaps, or an earring or something. My sister throws in her sweet 15 bracelet. She'd been asking and begging for that one for months. I asked her why later on. She said Grandma asked for it and shrugged. A few weeks after, back at home, my sister screams from her room. She was staring at her homework, said her hand felt odd and for some reason continued writing. Looked down at the paper and it's Grandma's handwriting. Says, "Thank you, I'll be in touch." My sister sees her from time to time. Recently, my sister had a daughter. We were hanging out and all of a sudden my sister did a cross over her forehead. We both looked at each other. When someone first visits a newborn, it is customary to pray and give the newborn a cross over their face to bless them with good luck and to keep bad spirits away. We figured it was Grandma's visit. Her daughter smiled in her sleep.
My grandmother's sister wanted to marry a U.S. soldier. This was South Korea during the Korean War. The sister had the idea that if she got pregnant, the soldier would marry her and bring her to the U.S. Sister gets pregnant and brags about how she hates kids. Tells the soldier she has good news and shows him a baby blanket. He tells her to never contact him again. She finds out that he was already married and had children in the U.S. Sister steps in front of a vehicle a month later and dies. Grandma kept the baby blanket for some reason. When I was born, my family moved to the U.S. My mom began seeing a creature under my crib that looked like a woman grinning at her. One day, she sees the creature putting its hand between the wall and my crib, wiggling its fingers at her. She tells my grandmother of the creature. My grandmother burns the sister's baby blanket in the backyard. It never came back.
I'm South African and grew up in the city. When I was about 8 years old, I had a dream about a woman lying on the ground opposite my bed, slowly rising with her hands pointing forwards, palms down. She stopped rising at exactly the point where our eyes met. Her face had everything that a normal human face has, except somehow void of any character. Perfect round eyes, small nose, small mouth and brown hair tied behind her head, but much too perfect. Not one stray hair. But she did remind me of old people somehow. Something in her face, I can't say exactly. Anyways, our eyes met and I was scared as never before. She then called out my name in a slow, dragging voice. While she called, her hands started twisting and kept on twisting. Both her hands out of sync, twisting one direction and then the other, totally unrestricted. I have more stories on her if anyone wants. Okay, so this all happened many years ago, but I never forgot her face. I had a bunch of other nightmares, but this one still sticks to me. A couple of months after my 18th birthday, I was lying in my bed trying to go to sleep. I felt scared for some reason and turned my light on. 5 minutes later, I was fast asleep. I started dreaming. She came through my door, not looking at me. I recognized her instantly and was filled with the same horror and dread that I felt all those years ago. I felt anxious. I just kept repeating in my mind, "Don't see me, please don't see me." She walked along past my bed at an incredibly slow pace, prolonging my terror. Eventually she passed my bed and I felt relief. She didn't see me. She was heading to my window. When she got there, she suddenly stopped and in one fluid motion she moved her head to meet my eyes. As soon as they met, she started immediately moving her head back to its original position. I woke up and started crying. I was paralyzed with fear. I sat upright and couldn't say a word. This lasted for approx 3 minutes. The rest of the night I spent watching movies from the corner of my room where I could see everything. I've never told anyone this. Then earlier this year, my mother told me about a dream she had where a woman was trying to strangle her in her bed. My parents still live in that house. My mom described her as emotionless with brown hair. She also said something about that woman that reminded her of me.
Native Hawaii Anon here. Most of my experiences with paranormal things have been pretty minor, but my grandpa told me one that really freaked me out. Apparently, he and Grandma had a nice plot of land overlooking the ocean that had been in the family for a while, and they were approached by a few people who wanted to buy it. One man in particular was very persistent, but Grandpa said that he didn't deserve the land, Something about him was wrong. After a few weeks, both of my grandparents started getting very sick, and nothing seemed to help. So they called in a local kahuna, like a priest or witch doctor, who immediately, upon arriving, told them that they had been cursed. After some prayers and rituals, he started searching around the property until he checked under the house. Many houses are on stilts to flooding. He emerged from under the house holding a bundle of tie leaves wrapped in braided hair that they said smelled like death. They threw it in a bag, lit it on fire, and tossed it off a cliff. When the bag landed, it exploded into black dust, and an ear-splitting shriek echoed from the cliffs. The next day, my grandparents were completely well. They did end up selling that place eventually, but they never saw the persistent man again.
Had a German Shepherd for 10 years, had gotten 2 of them, a brother and a sister at the same time when I was a kid. The brother dog had gotten Lyme disease and for a while was fine and was taking meds. Later it had gotten worse. I was living at a friend's house since I had moved out of my parents, came over and ended up seeing my dad cuddling with him because he was unable to get up or walk down the stairs to use the bathroom outside, so Dad would carry him. Look at the dog and pet him, saying I would see him later since I had something going on that day I couldn't miss. Dad ended up taking him over and putting him down. Comes home and the dogs are gone. Feels horrible. One night I was staying with my parents over a fight with my roommate and I saw my door open. I had closed the door and my windows weren't open. The door opens and I see a low black mist low to the ground go from my door to my bed and vanish. Starts crying and feels really happy at the same time and says goodbye to the dog. I have more stories that have happened to me over the years. I was 8 or 9 when I was at my friend's house. New neighbors moved in. A girl and an older boy had moved down the road into the old haunted house. A woman who would sit in her widow's tower hoping her husband would come back from a fishing trip. We made friends with the new neighbor's daughter who was our age, and we warned her, the house is haunted. She convinced us to stay with her for a night after we became friends, and our parents were fine with it. I was staying with my friend in a bedroom under the windows tower. We were about to go to bed when my friend turned the light switch off and walked about 2 feet away from it when it turned back on. A friend looks at me and goes back and flicks it off, struggling with it since it turned back on, but she slammed it off and ran back under the covers with me. I, being the logical one, tell her it's okay. It's just an old house. After getting her to finally sleep, I doze off and we hear a sound, like wood hitting the floor repeatedly. We wake up and look at each other. After this was still continuing, we decided it was the girl's other brother pulling a prank on us, so we left the room and climbed up the stairs to the widow's tower. Get to the top of the tower, nothing but an old rocking chair. Check windows for drafts, nothing. Friend starts walking downstairs first and turns back while talking to me, and her face turns completely white as she stops talking. I stare at her for a second and hear the sound of the rocking chair rock. I turn around and see an old lady rocking in her chair, smiling at us and knitting. Friend started running downstairs and I jumped down the small stairway like a ninja, and my friend began screaming. My neighbor's dad woke us up and made us some cocoa and told us we were dreaming and sent us back to bed. Starts walking back to bed when I walk backwards, and was talking to a friend at the same time when she turns pale again and starts staring behind me, and I knew what that meant. I turn around and see a 25-ish-year-old woman walking from one side of the hall, stopping and looking at me, curtsying, smiling, and walking through the wall holding her dress as she walks. Looks at friends and drops cocoa and runs back to our houses in PJs at 4 a.m.
In the interest of sharing, since that's what anons seem to be doing, I'll throw into the pot. Both of these stories are, as I know them, told back to me years later. I have no recollection of them happening in the first person. That weirds me out because I have a pretty sharp memory for things that happened to me as a kid, but whatever. The first story comes from when I was a toddler, and my mom was bathing me in the tub. Now, as I was old enough to sit in a tub unsupervised for a bit, my mom left the room for a second to do whatever it is mothers need to do. When she came back, I was smiling. She asked me why I was smiling. and I said it was because I was smiling at the man. What man? The man in the corner. Of course, my mom whips around, but there's no one there. Needless to say, the police were phoned, but the house was empty aside from the two of us. The second story goes like this. I was a really young kid, probably 5 or 6, and sleeping over at my great-aunt and uncle's house. My older cousin watched me mostly. At the time, if I recall, she was finishing her university degree. Apparently, one morning I went up to her and said, "You really freaked me out last night." When she asked me why, I'd told her that she'd been at the foot of my bed staring at me with red eyes. This wouldn't have particularly bothered her otherwise, being able to pass it off as a silly kid's dream, except for that her brother had had the exact same experience, sleeping in the same bed when they were both kids.
Not op, but I have some interesting family stories. I never met my great-grandmother, but my grandmother would tell me about her. She has been described as one of those people that sort of commanded authority when she said something would happen. It would happen. Like it was set in stone. Early on in her pregnancy with my great-aunt, before my grandmother, she bought 2 scrapbooks. And when my great-grandfather asked why she told him, one for our first girl and one for our second. Then when my grandmother was a young girl, she complained that she wanted a baby brother, and her mom would have none of it, saying that she would much rather raise daughters than rambunctious boys. My grandma threw a fit and said she wanted a brother. At this, great-grandma grabbed her shoulders and looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You're going to have boys." And that was the end of it. There are several other examples of this. She sort of scared the rest of the people in the tiny town they lived in the Midwest. They always sort of gave her a wide berth, though she would sometimes walk up to other women and congratulate them before they even knew they were pregnant. Other times, Grandma remembers walking to the store with her one day when she was about 9 or 10, and they always had this nosy old woman who was their neighbor who would gossip about her to the other women in her gardening club. They stopped and chatted for a bit to get formalities out of the way, and as the woman was telling great-grandma about the family that lived on the other side of her property, she told the woman to bite her tongue before she ate crow. A few days later, the woman choked to death on her lunch while her husband was at work. 10 or so years later, my grandmother met my grandfather. They had 5 boys, including my father. Despite trying to have at least one girl, they gave up after my youngest uncle was born because they ran out of room in their house. After years of working, my grandparents bought some land cheap and built a house on it, and my great-grandmother lived long enough to see it finished, told them their granddaughters and grandson would love and flourish in it, and died a few weeks later. 40 years later, the head count for grandchildren, including myself, is 8, all girls except for my cousin, who is the youngest and the last grandchild.
I am Native American. I was born in the year 91. I am currently 20, going on 21. I have my real father and a stepmother who has raised me as her own. Now that I got your attention. Once as a child, I simply slept. But it was not a normal sleep. It was a deep sleep. But the dream I had was not a real dream, but a surreal dream. I have no recollection of it due to repression of the memory, but what happened next I can never forget. In my old house, my room was next to the bathroom. I had a little Marvin the Martian mug in said bathroom. I woke up extremely hot and thirsty. I wandered into the bathroom to retrieve my mug and get some refreshment. However, someone called my name quietly, so I pursued the voice. I followed the voice into the hallway. The hallway is square and separates into 2 corridors, one with a window and one with the laundry room, which was safer, and I wish I took that corridor. As I walked ever so slowly near the window, I heard a voice whisper, "What are you doing?" I stopped dead in my tracks and began to panic. "Come to me!" the voice shouted. I bolt like I don't believe in oxygen or physics. My father rushes from his room and saves me before I run out the front door to the house, straight into the arms of my birth mother. She was a witch, needing me for a sacrifice to live on. Because of this, my life in the beginning was one bad joke after another.
A lot of my family in the Philippines, I'm a half Filipino, seem to have some form of paranormal abilities, mostly on the female side. Mostly it's all about being able to attract wandering spirits and entities, and such. I've got 2 interesting tales from my Filipino relations and a couple from the English side, but I'll get to those later. First, and most interesting, is something that happened to my auntie. She was walking home from a party at night, something not really advised if you want to be safe in a rural area, really. Anyway, she suddenly noticed she'd been walking the same bit of path over and over before starting to see everything going black around her. She began to panic a little before realizing it was probably a manananggal. Then she began to hear a loud tick-tick from behind her, followed by a quieter tick-tick, also behind her. That confirmed it, so she whipped out her knife. I should mention at this stage that because our family has a lot of encounters, my grandfather had some special knives made with a silver steel alloy for just such events, and slashed in front of her. She remembered being covered in some red goop and just running as fast as she could back home. The next day, she and Grandpa went to investigate where it had happened, and they found a pool of blood on the ground with a blood trail leading away. Of course, they decided to follow the trail to make sure it was a supernatural entity and not some poor sod who got on my aunt's bad side. Next to a pair of shriveled legs, they found a similarly dried torso with ripped-up wings. The blood was still slightly damp on the ground, and the clothing on the remains was still wet with blood. The other Filipino tale I have is about my mum. I've only recently been told some of this. Over the past year, it's cropped up a lot, so Mum told me everything. Shortly after she was born, there were sightings of a very unusual snake in the house, red and brown with pink markings. It was usually sighted in Mum's general vicinity. My great-grandparents began to suspect she had a twin snake, a guardian spirit of sorts. One night, my auntie, not the aunt from the previous post, saw a snake in the cot with Mum. So my auntie grabbed the snake and removed it from the cot, slicing the head off. My mum woke up in her cot covered in bruises, and there was no sign of any snake save for some blood on the knife. My great-grandparents nodded and forbade anyone in the house to harm a snake, just in case it was my mum's twin. And so the sightings continued as Mum was growing up. Eventually, Mum was able to sense the snake's presence, and the snake wasn't seen so often. But Mum could feel it was there, looking out for her. And it's been a good sign. If something bad was going to happen, the snake would kind of warn her, or frighten the living daylights out of those who wished harm on Mum, or the family in general, come to think of it. Now my relatives take seeing a huge red, brown, and pink snake as a sign Mum's going to visit, and as a reassurance. Sometimes we see it here too. It usually crops up when there's trouble brewing. It's not just my Filipino relatives that get all the fun. The English half of my family have something. Funnily enough, it's the male side of the family this time, but not so common. Just the general ability to work with nature very well. My dad and just one of my uncles have got green fingers and can pretty much animal whisper. Dad's very well known for getting angry pit bulls to calm down in seconds. There have been times where the dog owners were pretty sure the dogs would ravage him, and the dogs decide to just try and lick him to death. And then here's the interesting thing. Dad had a run-in with a local hellhound. He said it was a huge black dog with faintly glowing red eyes, something like a Saint Bernard on steroids. Usually it's a bad omen in these parts, but we've never had anything bad happen. Apparently, Dad bowed to it, and it just appears up every now and again to Dad. It usually follows me if I'm coming home late and in the dark. I can sense it but not see it. Something I picked up from my parents. We always thank it. It won't give you trouble if you're polite. So if you run into it in the Malden area, be polite and greet it properly. Fear is the worst thing you can show it.
Here's a story of my uncle. B-Uncle. 1960s to 70s. Went to a party in downtown Dallas. Driving home toward Oak Cliff. On Sylvan Avenue Bridge that crosses the Trinity River. See a woman in white dress. Probably going home from a party. Offer a ride. Before she gets in, he gets a creepy vibe from her. Speeds off home. My uncle either survived a woman in white scenario or was a total ass to some chick.
I'm only halfway through this thread, but it is really amazing. Wanted to add kind of a story myself, but it isn't about exotic immigration though. It's the strange history of emigration of my German family line. Big and wealthy half-Polish German family living in a smaller town in northwestern Germany in the 20s. That's where I start to explain for storytelling reasons. Family tradition for the men to be Freemasons. In the post-World War I economy, most of them got a business going. One of them, called Dionysus like the god, had the first modern-era car in this town, where I still live BTW. Now, I never met any living person in my family who still knew him, but he had kind of a legacy mythology going. So people knew he was strange but also respectful. Always signed his name with a triangle with a single point in the top corner. Not making this up, this I have seen myself. So anyway, the story revolved around this guy and two other male siblings who decided to emigrate to the USA before the Nazis even existed in Germany. To the knowledge of my family, they settled in New York, but before 6 years had passed, they were back. But only two of them, since one of them died, not Dionysus, his brother being described ever since then as a changed person. Dionysus was still strange, and I was told people alive in the house at that time all suspected he was mentally ill. I realize this isn't very good storytelling, but I'm trying to give context to some events I will describe later. Okay, so next, sometime later, could be about 10 years or shortly before Nazis slowly took over here, the arrangement of people had changed radically. My grandmother now lives there, who was teenager during the coming war, along with other distant relatives of mine who are now old people or dead. The house still belonged to those creepy old men, but they only occupied the 2 rooms at the very top, very high house. They were still active Freemasons, but abandoned that sometime later. So anyway, during the war, a big hall, which is about 1/3 of this property, was used as a station for recycling cloth and other stuff. It was involved with making use of stuff the state took possession of. I'm told that most people who worked there were semi-slaves and only a few regular German workers. This could have been semi-illegal as well. So the reason I explain all this is because after the war, shortly before he died, Dionysus was described by everyone as relieved. And my grandmother told me he explained to her that he was glad he could make up for what happened in America to him by giving those people a chance. I know this could all be justification for exploit. She also said he was glad Germany lost. He never explained what happened in the USA exactly though. 2 years before he died, he at least 3 times did a seance with many people living there at the time participating. For example, my grandmother too. She told me that he seemed very excited every time they did this, even though most of them were Catholic. That she was under the impression that that's what Freemasons do for most of her life and what happened. Names and answers were spelled with those Ouija boards, and she even said the table levitated for a few seconds and stuff on the walls began to vibrate slightly. Don't know but that. So yeah, few years after the war, when the people whose descendants now live here pretty much all lived here already, they did one more seance, amateur lead by one of the men at the time, not Freemasons anymore, and they still got something. But this time my grandmother said it felt very different. They were very scared and it did seem out of control. She claimed 2 people fled from the room even, our kitchen, and she and the man leading were the only ones left at the end. She told me at that moment she missed Dionysus very much, and they never did another seance in this house. Most of those families even became quite Christian. Other quick points. I talked about this stuff with my grandma last year. She's very devout Catholic now, and she still looked back on those early seances fondly. She even said she would do it again if someone could do it, which shocked my mother and made me. Other quick points. After Dionysus died, some people said they felt uneasy at the top of the house. My grandmother said it has, a bad aura. That's where me and my sister live now, by the way. But that could also be because for decades there hung a giant religious picture between the rooms with angels, etc. Also this. A few years ago, when I was reading New Agey books about contacting the spirit world while lying in bed in one of those 2 rooms at the top, I clearly could hear scratches on the wall at my head. Behind that wall is a very small passage which connects the 2 rooms in a very strange and kinda creepy way. It wasn't the wind or anything. At first it didn't scare me, but when I scratched on my side and it got louder and closer on the other side, I noped out of there and slept in another room. Never finished that book. Last year, we opened up some of the cement ground behind the hall. In the 50s, the natural ground was cemented over. We found some cool shit, various used bullets, something which appears to be a sword hilt without a blade, and the best part, a totally only bones left right hand of a human. One last thing. The men of that era of my family have a cool and creepy legacy, but it's also claimed. And since at times this was a nearly all-male house, that there were strange parties going on here. In my room even. Amusingly, this part of the past is the one they never want to talk to me about, haha. That's it.
2 stories from my travels to the Philippines. When I was about 10, my parents and my little brother, who was 7 at the time, visited my dad's hometown in the province of Ilocos Sur. This place is out in the boondocks away from the big cities. We stayed at my grandma's house, and my dad told her we are planning to visit his high school friend in a nearby town. My grandma warns him against it because there's a witch in that area. My parents believe she's just being superstitious and decide to visit anyway. It's about an hour away, and we end up staying late in the evening. As it's getting late, my mom tells my dad they should head back. The host insists for us to stay, and it borderline becomes an argument between my parents and the host. Eventually, we end heading back to my grandma's. On the way back, my little brother comes down with a fever. By the time we get back to my grandma's, my brother is very ill. So my parents wake up my grandma to ask for some medicine. As she does, my mom tries to comfort him, and he wakes up, looks right at her, and in a deep voice says, "I don't know you, I hate you." But the effed up thing about it is he says it in the native language Ilocano, a language me and my brother don't know since we were born and raised in America. My grandma sees this and is convinced he's cursed. She starts doing some prayer and wraps banana leaves around my brother's head and burns some type of plant around him. Eventually, my little brother wakes up and says, "I'm hungry" in English. The curse was lifted, and my little brother doesn't remember any of it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.